Hi, thanks for joining. In today's video, we'll be looking at a new multi-agent framework from a professional ML and AI developer with many years experience, and also known for his YouTube channel, vSphere, has created a new open source framework called Agency Swarm. It's the first one that I've looked at that is built specifically for the Assistance API. So we'll look at an overview. We're going to look at a notebook that I updated. Let's give a quick introductory tutorial, run an exercise that I had to create a Taylor Swift fan site with upcoming tour dates. So we'll look at how it handled that and talk more about this really interesting new multi-agent framework. So let's get started. We're going to be focusing mostly on through an introductory tutorial notebook. We'll do a brief overview first of the Agency Swarm project. I'm going to save most of that commentary for another video that'll capture my full thoughts on my initial experience with it. But some of the standout aspects of why you might want to consider this framework are that it's one of the only multi-agent frameworks built entirely around the Assistance API. Now, part of that is because it's newer, so it doesn't have as much breadth and quantity of code as some of the frameworks that have been around longer. But I think there have been some really good design decisions, a really good quality code. The code is organized really, really nicely. Now, the repo that I'm looking at here is github.com VRSEN/agency-swarm. And also the YouTube videos are under this name, but his name is pronounced vSphere. Some of the cool things about this, right, are ability to have a lot of control, a higher quality than a lot of Python projects that are out there. So enforcing these pydantic schemas is a great way to organize your objects, your tools and agents and so on with clearly defined schemas, but still using Python and to enforce types. vSphere promotes this as a production quality framework. I think that's perfectly fine, but I do think that everyone has a little different opinion of what is production quality for them. That there has been a lot of effort to make this high quality code, and I fully respect vSphere's opinion on the quality of that. I do just defer that as a opinion that should be made by the developers and organizations that are implementing a project and then have to support that code base. Answering that initial question is, should I spend my time here? Something else could change in the AI landscape. What happens if this project ever gets neglected or falls by the wayside, as many projects do? How much value do I get out of it in the amount of time I put into it is a very important question. And I think there's a lot of really powerful things here. Most of this repository are things to help you make agents using the Assistance API from code. You can go into your code base, you can use this agent and base tool classes that are provided by this framework to more easily instantiate an agent and use it as you would any other agent on the Assistance API. You can log into your OpenAI platform. You can see right there in the graphical interface that once you create an agent in code with using the tools in this framework, it just creates a standard Assistance API based agent. And so if for anything happens to this framework, most of what you've done in it are create assistants that you can continue to go on and use. And the other aspect of that, as you create those agents for the Assistance API, being able to import any tool from LangChain in one line of code. So that it really does a lot to say, hey, I can be productive in this framework. Even if this framework were to fall by the wayside, to be able to create Assistance API-based agents and be able to incorporate lots of tools very quickly by pulling them in from the LangChain ecosystem is a powerful element. And another one that has a tremendous potential is the tool factory component of this library has the ability to import and create tools for the agents from OpenAPI schema. And so I have to test this more thoroughly. I would guess that straightforward APIs probably do well, and that maybe some of these really complicated and clunky and not very well designed APIs might be more of a struggle. I do want to play with this a lot more to see how far can I go. Can I just take all the open API schemas I can find out there and just automatically create usable tools for agents? The potential of this tool alone, I think, is really powerful. Let's go ahead. I'll save any other opinions I have about the framework for my review video where we talk a little bit more about pros and cons and some other experiences I've had using the agency swarm over the past few days. What we'll be going through is a notebook that I've created. This is based on a notebook from the very first tutorial video that Arsen has on his YouTube for agency swarm. I went in and modified pretty much everything in that, and so it's very loosely based on that earlier notebook. And so let's go through this. Actually, before I get into the notebook itself, I wanted to show how I set up the environment. You can absolutely run this in Colab. It's very easy to do so there. I like to run this in my own environment, especially in cases where, like I am now, I'm generating code. And that way the files are already saved in an environment where I can just immediately go ahead and test the code. And even if I want to iterate with the agents and have them continue to improve the code, I can test it, check on it, ask them to go back and change something. I think it is convenient to run the notebooks in your own environment. And so I'm running it inside of a container, in my case on my Kubernetes. I run a Tanzu Kubernetes cluster, but you could use any Kubernetes. Now, you don't need any Kubernetes to follow along with this tutorial. You don't need to have a container. You can the steps perfectly fine just from your own local command line Python environment. Now, why I do recommend a container, not necessarily Kubernetes. I think it has some advantage if you happen to have access to Kubernetes clusters. Great. Like, I use that primarily because I have a cluster that's sitting there that I have plenty of access to, so why gum up my own local computer, and why not take advantage of a more performant server, and also where it may ultimately run. The advantage of a container is that it's not your local environment. It protects your local environment, right? If something gets screwed up inside of the container, especially if you're having agents write code arbitrarily for you, it's a great practice to secure that. But if you think about different things that you experiment with, if you put those all on your local computer's terminal session, you can end up having all types of things saved in your terminal settings and variables and configuration that could potentially conflict with some other project that you're going to try tomorrow or the next day, or you have to go through a bunch of additional complexity to avoid that. A container is a separate environment, and you can have it as standard Linux environment. I run a plain vanilla Ubuntu container. I do not use Conda. I don't have a problem with Conda, but in general, I'm thinking about making production code, not sharing data science notebooks with other data scientists. There's nothing wrong with that. If your goal may be to run code in production, Conda has over 300 different Python libraries pre-installed in it. That's not what you want when you push something to production. You want to have nothing in it other than what it needs. Everything, little thing above what you absolutely need to run your project. It's not just extra overhead, it's also security vulnerabilities. So I run this on a slim, completely vanilla Ubuntu container with nothing in it. And that way I know when I want to go to prepare, if I want to share on a blog and in a video and other people want to copy what I'm doing, I can say with certainty, if you take the same container and you follow these same steps, and if I want to go to production, I know exactly what my dependencies are. So those are the reasons why you may want to run it in a container. I have Docker Desktop from my work. I don't have to pay for it. It's great. So I recommend Docker Desktop if you're running containers locally on your desktop. Now, if you don't want to pay, I totally get. There's really great programs that you can use that give you roughly equivalent functionality that allow you to run containers on your desktop, supported across all the major operating systems. So if you would like to run a container, then you can go to podman.io and make sure that your computer meets whatever requirements that you need to have. Once you do that, I use Visual Studio Code, and if you're using Kubernetes, you grab this Kubernetes extension by Microsoft, and then you can spin up a container. This means is that this container, it's not durable. My Kubernetes cluster is highly reliable, so this has been running, for quite a while. But at the same time, containers can restart at any point. And so it's important to remember, if you do use Kubernetes and you use some methodology like, this is not durable, and I don't want it to be durable, right? I want this to, if something happens and this restarts, or later I'll just come in and delete it, and I don't have to worry about it. I don't have something else I have to think about and maintain. And what if I lose something? Well, that's why I use Git. Right, so I have my code on Git repository. If I'm going to do a session of working on something, I make sure that I upload all the stuff I'm working on to my Git repository, and that way when I walk away at the end of the day, if something happens to this particular container and I'm not done with it yet, it doesn't matter, because I have everything saved on my Git repository. I start with this command. You might get a Ubuntu container a different way, right? You can just get it from Docker Hub. And I just do apt update and apt upgrade. Then I install my Python 3 Vend, and Python 3 pip. I put in git and curl to in case, and then I also use a virtual environment. Now, once you do that, now I can go ahead and I can connect to the container. So here I have the actual environment. This is where I am running my Jupyter server from, and you can see here I have cloned the agency swarm repository. Now, to run Jupyter, it's very simple. Pip install Jupyter. I just will install and spin it up whenever I need to. So you can just run Jupyter Notebook root, and you can see it's running. And you notice, because of those extensions I mentioned, I can open this locally, just like I'm running it on a local container. Or if you're running it locally or on a local container, I need to go into agency swarm. I have another folder called notebooks here. And here you can see I have my agency swarm tutorial, and I can open that here. Let's go ahead and dig into the project. And so what I did here, basically created an agency with a project manager, and there's a virtual assistant that can do research and web searches, and a coding agent that can write code. And came up with a project that I thought would get some hits and be fun for people. Just did a Taylor Swift fan site. What I really wanted to do is go in and grab the dates off of the tours page and then create a fan site-like page. It's really nothing that would be used seriously, but just a simple exercise. I wanted to find something that would require the project manager, the developer, and the researcher more as a multi-agent team, but that also shows some of the benefits of a multi-agent framework as opposed to a single agent tool, many of which are extremely capable. So it's hard in a simple example to show the benefits of what multi-agent can bring to the table. When I was playing with different ideas, one prompt that I put in for this solution we're looking at today is to exemplify some of those emergent behaviors that you don't expect to happen. So the first thing that we do here is we install the pip install here in this first box of this notebook. I have it installing based on a fork or a copy of the official repository, and I've created a branch. That's what this @notebook-update-a fuel is, put a particular branch of my repository. And the reason why I'm having it load this is I made one small change to the source code. I've already committed it to the official agency swarm project. It hasn't been merged yet, which is why this is still pointing to this branch. So if you were to copy my work exactly, you can use this. You could also do agency swarm. And the key differences here, if you're going to demo this based on the Gradio user interface, Gradio is a very simplistic, fast, easy to use web UI that's often used for simple data science projects or running quick demos. For the purpose of the agency swarm project, Gradio is included in the agency class in a demo. The function is called demo Gradio. This is a great way to be able to test your code with Gradio, and you'll have it in a web user interface. But there's this ability to do this share equals true, where if you're running this in your own environment or inside of a container, as I am, having that ability to pass in share equals true, so that creates a public URL, it's important. And that's the change that I made. Now, if you're doing this on Colab, Colab has some special magic behind the scenes stuff that they do that makes it to where you don't need to pass in this variable. If you want to have the public URL and you're doing it on Colab, you get that even without this. And you also don't need to demo it with Gradio. If you look in the agency class, there's a function called run demo, which will just run it interactively like a command prompt. I start off here with installing basing in my fork so I can pass through that shared equals true flag. And we also install Gradio and DuckDuckGo search, which we'll see we use here. And when you're running your Python notebook and you just execute your first cell, next thing is there's a little function that just simplifies instantiating the OpenAI key in all the places that needs to be instantiated. And so they have this set OpenAI key function. And I like that in this version of the Python notebook, they use getPass here. And this is really useful if you're recording videos and you don't want to show your OpenAI. The first agent I create here is a project manager agent. I was basing this based on a previous a chart which Arsen had put together as one of his initial early attempts, and it was a CEO. I changed it to a project manager, and I changed this text quite a bit. I went into ChatGPT. There's some custom GPT meant for helping to construct agents, and I just asked for a project manager prompt based on some criteria I put in. One of the reasons why I'm using it is because I did experiment with some of those initial prompts that were already there. Doing some of the searches like we'll show that I'm doing here, asking to go and find the Taylor Swift tour dates. It was having some struggle with it initially, and I used these instructions both for the project manager and the virtual assistant that I got from one of those custom GPTs. It worked, right? I was able to do some of the queries I had been trying to do that were not working well, and this worked well. So I think there's a ton of opportunity to refine and to change, and this is just a science into of itself as to what prompt will ultimately be the most succinct and work most effectively here. But this one worked well for the little bit of experimentation that I've done over the past few days with this project. So the first thing that we're doing here, when we define our agent, we give it some instructions. These instructions can be saved in a file, or you can save it in a variable. Once you've defined the instructions, you can go ahead and instantiate the agent. You can see here I am importing that agent class from agency swarm, and so I instantiate an instance that I call project manager or proj manager, and we can see here that instantiates from this agent class that's provided by the agency swarm, and I have the ability to give it a name. There's a few well-defined field types here. I give it a description. These descriptions are important because when an agent in this framework communicates with another agent, to determine what other agents they should talk to and what they should be asking other agents to do based on this description. So the descriptions should be simple and without a lot of additional prose, will succinctly mention the capabilities of an agent so they can easily find each other and ask the appropriate tasks for other agents. And you can see here for the instructions, I passed in that variable we created. We did not give it any files folder or tools. This is just based on this description that it's going to be operating. The next one, we're going to create this virtual assistant, which is essentially a research assistant here. And I really appreciated this custom tool, which came from Arsen's notebook. It's a really simple way to show how you can add a lot of value. And so here we have this custom tool that we're going to create, and it is just giving the ability for the agent to search the internet. Now, if you've done programmatic internet searching, it usually involves a paid API key from one of the service providers that for Google or several other internet search engines have API keys that you pay, but I didn't realize you use the DuckDuckGo search Python library. You don't need to have a special API key, and in my experience, it's worked well. And this class is just so simple. So the first thing we do is we give it a description for the search web class, and we can create a description for each of the different fields that we have in our schema. And very simply, just instantiate the DuckDuckGo search, and we can return to pass our search string from the field, execute a search, and return back up to 3 search results. And you can go ahead and adjust this number as you see fit. But just that is the shortest and simplest web search function I've seen incorporated into an AI tool in just a few lines of code. really great example of how simple it can be. Now, a lot of your functions are going to be more complex, and that's fine, but I think it's cool to show how simple it can be to create custom tools for agents. So now we've created this tool, but we haven't assigned it to an agent. So we'll go ahead and create our virtual assistant agent. We create a variable called VA_instructions. You could name this whatever you want to. And we put in these instructions for virtual assistant. And you can define this as a locally saved file, or you can put it into a variable like this. I don't like that these are verbose, right? Like we're chewing up a lot of our prompt space with verbose instructions. But at the end of the day, it's all about what gets you to solve the use case that you have. Then we can refine on these other points, but I think the key point is what's your use case, what's your goal, get it done reliably and consistently and effectively. If to get the use case done, you need to have a longer prompt. That's part of the cost of doing business, right? And potentially you're definitely good to go in and experiment and see how much you can refine and improve on this. But if at the end of the day you still end up with a longer prompt to get your use case accomplished, you've accomplished your use case. Okay, now we go ahead and instantiate this variable. I call this agent VA. It's based on that agent class again. We give it a name, a description, instructions, tools, and search web. And that's it for the virtual assistant. Now the developer agent, this really highlights the potential of the framework. It's clear from the intent that they hope to have a whole lot more agent types available within the framework itself. Again, there's only a few agent types here. And we can see there's a browsing agent and a coding agent. And that Genesis is that factory that is meant to create agents and agencies that I think is still being developed, but should be close to being ready for prime time. And we'll go back to our notebook here. And when we want to incorporate an agent, it's just this simple. And if you're wondering, oh, what were its instructions? What is the agent made up of? That's another nice thing about this framework being so well organized. It's very, very easy to see exactly what is a coding agent. So we go into our agents on the repository. We can see here coding, obviously our coding agent. And then we dive into our coding agent. And we can see the coding agent's code right here. And we can see its instructions. And so let's just look at the code real quick. This adds some tools. Ultimately, this is importing code interpreter. After you create and instantiate an agent based on this, you can go into your OpenAI platform and you'll see that you've created an agent that has the code interpreter functionality enabled. If there's agents there that you don't need to think about how exactly they're made, you can test them out and see if they do the job that you need them to do. To import agents that exist in the framework, you have this shared instruction set called an agency manifesto applied to all of the different agents that are part of that agency. This was in the notebook that Arsen had previously created, and I just left it the same. I did try some variations of it, but I do think that changing this can be very impactful depending on what you're asking the tool to do. I didn't think for the simple exercises that I've been running so far that changing this would have much of an impact. So last thing, we're defining the communication flows, and so we import this agency class, and under agency swarm you just go into agencies and you can look through the code yourself, and you can see for the messaging framework here. It's well documented and relatively simple code. These communication flows are essentially who's allowed to instantiate a conversation. The project manager can reach out to the developer agent, and the developer can respond back. It would have to say dev, pod manager in order for the developer to initiate a new conversation with the project manager. And so that works fine for my project. And depending on your project, you need to think about who should be contacting who. So we allow the project manager to contact both of our other agents, and we also allow our developer to initiate a conversation with the agent. I think if you did get into this framework, you may have to learn to play with these settings a little bit. In some cases, these default will work just fine, but I look forward to when this is better documented. I'd like to have a better understanding of what to expect when you're working with customizations to these examples. Once you've created your agency, you can start your agency up. You can use the demo Gradio function, or if we go back to agency, we can see there's this run demo as well. So Here's the demo Gradio function. So this runs a demonstration of the agency capabilities in an interactive command line interface. If you do run demo, it looks exactly the same, but instead of bringing up a Gradio web interface, you can have an interactive command line session. But the interactions that you have, I didn't see any additional logging or anything when I ran through the command line tool as opposed to the Gradio interface. If you pass this share equals true value, this is not in RSEN's library, but I did already submit it, and he already responded saying that he'd be merging it soon. So at some point in the near future, you may be able to pass this share equals true value in here. Now, in my case, I'm running my Jupyter Notebook server inside of a container, and it's actually running on Kubernetes. But regardless, if you're running in a container, if you have an inner process, it's something internal to the container, it needs to be on like a 0.0 interface, or you can use this nice attribute of Gradio to where it'll just create a public URL for you. Now, if you do this in Colab, you would see if you didn't pass in share equals true value, you would see with an error. Oh, you have to say share equals true if you want to public URL, but then it creates a public URL anyways, and that's some magic stuff that Colab does underneath the covers. I don't know how that's done, but it works, right? But if you're running this in your own environments, it doesn't create a public URL unless you pass in this value. So that's why this is here, and then you'll get the public URL. Now, in the notebook, once I've got to this point, it's kind of clunky to use the Gradio interface in here. We've already got a public URL. So I just go click on the public URL. Now we can see here, I've already had this conversation. I could redo this live, but I really liked the way everything went here. I said, could you get the list of upcoming tour dates from Taylor Swift's official tour page, and should include the date, venue, location, and link for more details. Then make a web page in the style of a Taylor Swift fan site and put the details for the upcoming tour dates in a nicely styled table. Now, awkwardly worded, I went through a lot of different iterations with similar prompts, but it actually got some behaviors that worked really well versus some of the other attempts that I did. I wanted to roll with this exact description. If you do this same exact notebook and this same question, it should likely have the same response or something very close to it. And so the first thing you can see, the project manager executes a function, and this is that send message function that is included in our agency class. It's taken what I typed in, it summarizes it a little bit, and forwards it to the virtual assistant. So if you remember, the virtual assistant is the one member of our three agents that has the ability to search the web. So you can see it sends it in the executing function, and there's the same thing without the command syntax. If you were going to create a client UI for this, rather than just this sample demo, you'd have that ability to show logging levels to where you could say one of your levels expose this in the client interface, so you can see what's happening without seeing all of the messaging syntax. So it's nice that they have two levels of messaging, and we can see what the virtual assistant is doing. It's conducting a search with the phrase Taylor Swift official tour page, and you can see again it's finding some information as it does searches and thinking a little bit more, gathering this information, and you can see here it updates with what it's thinking as it goes, and sometimes it doesn't come up with exactly what I want, but more important is this is just continuing to work on its own or talking with the others. So here we can see the virtual assistant tells the project manager, here's the official page, the URL for the tour page. There are some specific dates mentioned, and then it says to compile a complete and current list of our upcoming tour dates, blah, 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 blah. Now, that's not what the coder agent's going to need. Remember, I asked it to create a web page that had the upcoming tour dates. The project manager tells the coding agent, please design a web page. Now, I was actually thinking it's like a basic HTML page that would have a table on it, and it did a little bit more. I did say nicely styled table. So the project manager added that it should be a mobile, responsive, and accessible website. I never said that. So that's a really nice plus that the project manager realized, hey, those are good attributes, and I decided to add that additional detail on my behalf. Now, this is interesting. If I go back to my virtual agent description, agents find each other and they decide what they're going to ask each other based on the description. Now, this description, the notebook that I originally based this on had a whole proposal writing capability for the virtual assistant. And I got rid of that section from the instructions because I wasn't going to do this writing proposal part. But the description still says that the virtual assistant can write proposals. So I did not expect this. And I also had given the ability for the developer agent to contact the virtual assistant directly. And so after the project manager asks the coding agent to create this web page, the coding agent decided that it wanted a proposal. So apparently it saw that the virtual assistant had the ability to write proposals, and the coding agent directly contacted the virtual assistant here to ask for a proposal. Please draft a proposal for a web page, blah, 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 blah. And so it kind of turns around what the project manager asked it to do, and it passes that along to the virtual assistant. Now, this is where things start to get really interesting, and you can see here I needed a proposal. Now, look at this proposal that the virtual assistant, the original virtual assistant I based this on had some instruction and information about how to create a proposal. I got rid of all that. So while the description said it could write proposals, I didn't tell it how to write a proposal or give it any instructions as to how to write a proposal. And I thought this was pretty impressive. It comes up with this proposal. It includes that mobile responsiveness that was initially suggested by the project manager, and it spells out the accessibility requirements a little bit more. It adds dynamic table listing, which is interesting, and it adds a lot of additional nice little detail about how to do this. Well, those are all things I gave a very brief description. It did more. Now look at the development. We want front-end technologies. I didn't tell what front-end technologies. It picked some good ones, right? HTML5, CSS, modern JavaScript frameworks. So I thought really cool that it came out with SEO best practices all on its own. Now, the other point, it gave a human-like project timeline. Agents don't need this type of project timeline because they just work constantly. But I thought that was funny that it came out with a project timeline. And this is communication between the agents. So the project manager never actually gave this timeline back to me. The project manager, I think, probably knows that's not a relevant part of the proposal, but it's interesting that it came up with that. Now, the coding agent communicates this. The virtual assistant gave this information to the coding agent. The coding agent then communicated it back to the project manager and asked the project manager if we should proceed. The project manager then, without asking me anything, so I thought this was interesting because a lot of times these will come back and say, it'll ask the user, me, should I proceed? But this one, just the coding asked the project manager, and the project manager says, yes, go ahead, do it. And it added a little more detail, include a header, possibly a navigation bar, main section. This is all emergent behavior. I didn't ask for any of this. I didn't expect this to happen. Yeah, I think we could definitely get more sophisticated code developed even in a single agent framework. It wouldn't have happened this way. And I think this really shows the potential. Like if you're starting to ask, right, have it create more complex projects than you can usually get out of a single agent prompt because it'll start to get lost. This type of emergent behavior where the agents interacting by themselves is what brings the power of the multi-agent framework. You can see a lot of times it's able to make good decisions and to solve challenges that a lot of times single agents will get stuck on or just not be able to iterate through. And so now we go through the coding agent executing functions, writing code, and they go back and forth. The coding agent goes to the project manager and says, here's what I've done so far. Would you like to proceed? And once again, on my behalf, the project manager doesn't come out and ask me anything. It says, can you create a mock-up design for this fan site? Focus on color palette, typography, graphics. I never told it to do any of this. And it again highlights that power of that multi-agent workflow. A lot of times if I was doing code generation and website generation with single agents, like a custom GPT, it's them coming back and asking you, the end user, this similar type of question. And I'm really glad that the project manager can handle this on my behalf. There are times where I would like it to come back and ask me. I want to reduce those. I appreciate that each time the project manager engaged the developer agent when it was saying, should I proceed? It was making good decisions to get me up to the point where it gives first draft. once we get to the point where we're going to draft, it actually asks, do I want to continue to iterate on it? So it doesn't remove my ability to interact and to define what I want and to have it further customized and refine this to my goal. I think that project manager interaction that we saw there, it just reduces, by the time it gets to me and me needing to be interactive, it's done more than it would have done otherwise, for better or for worse. In this case, I think it was for better. But ultimately, even if it's something where I want to be involved in the design, I think it's powerful that the amount of touch points I need to have versus if I go into like a single agent interaction, it's my experience with that is like it's constantly coming back and asking me, and I'm constantly every single one of these similar types of steps. And so again, I think to get your desired outcome, you still need to be in the loop to some extent, or potentially, if you get this refined enough, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, maybe the human doesn't need to be in the loop at all for a refined outcome. So the coding agent going back and forth with the project manager. And this is one of the limitations I had this versus custom GPTs. The number one coding agent in the custom GPT framework right now is named Grimoire. And that one is tied into GPT-4 Vision already. When I've done interactions with it, it'll come back and give me a visual mock-up of what it wants, which is incredibly useful. I think based on the browsing agent, we could set this up to access the GPT-4 Vision. I didn't set that up, and so it's doing all this based on not using Vision. It saves money. If you do compare this with a single agent framework, for a fair comparison, it should be done versus one that doesn't have Vision. And also, no, we could be tying it into that Vision model and take this demo to the next level. It can be even more mature when it incorporates that Vision model. The one thing that is weird about this is I'm not exactly sure where it got these tour dates from. I think it may be a complete hallucination, because as I know from other conversations that I've had with this agent, that the virtual assistant can get the tour dates from the website. But for whatever reason, in this instance, it struggled. If you go to the Taylor Swift tour site webpage, you'll see the dates are listed right there. That I have gotten this virtual assistant with the same exact search web function to be able to give me those dates. So I know that the virtual assistant can get the real dates, and in this example, it didn't. I haven't checked to see if these are actual old tour dates. These are all past, but I did notice that the details, it's those example.coms. I suspect that these are hallucinating. If we go to the official one, let's just see. This is the official page. You can see right here, dates. So this is what the page I'm trying to get the dates off of, and I clearly did not get the dates, even though it can. Because I have worded it in ways that it has actually gotten these exact correct dates. A little refinement, it's definitely possible to get the correct dates. But nonetheless, going on with the simple example here, it did use the wrong dates. So that's one ding on, and that'd be more of a ding of how I've instructed the agents, the prompt that I'm using. And so we see the coding agent and the project manager agent. They're just doing a lot of back and forth. And in my experience with other single agent solutions, it is a lot more of the user being in the loop to be able to go through these iterations with the coding agent. You can see through here, the coding agent needs feedback on some of this stuff. And a lot of times it goes further because the project manager instructs, as we've seen in some of these messages, the project manager actually gives back intelligent instructions. So up until here, all these things I've been through, the very first thing I asked, it hasn't come back and asked me anything. It's between the virtual agent, the developer agents, and the project manager have been just working between themselves to get to this point. And finally, we're at this point now. The project manager finally comes back and checks in with me and says, here's a little bit about what it's done so far. They've got the tour dates table. They've got a web page. They've taken some design elements. They've got a color scheme. The key thing to note here is it says, can we polish this, right? Would you like to? Now, this is running inside of a container. With Gradio, one downside is we can't download files, right? I assume within Agent Swarm, that's one question I have is, Do the agent classes have the ability to take advantage of the assistance API's ability to upload files for like retrieval and augmented generation or download files? And I'm not sure about the schema. There's interesting things when I look at the code that's still under work. Either case, we're looking at a demo Gradio interface here that's not going to have that functionality. So if we wanted to have that ability to directly download code, we'd probably build it into our client's interface, and hopefully the agency swarm library has the right elements to make it simple to take advantage of those API extensions that exist for uploading and downloading files. But yeah, we'd have to build in an interface. While you're bootstrapping, I cloned the repository and I'm running the notebook directly from an inner environment that has that repository, and it just saves the files to the same directory where I'm running the notebook from. So you can go right in that directory and find the files. And so at this point where it asks me, do I want to polish or do I want to refine, or would you want us to proceed with writing some JavaScript interactive functionalities? Now, I never asked for that, right? I said make the visual styling of the table good, but I didn't expect to make a dynamic table that you could sort, which it did actually do. So I figured, hey, we'll leave the design how it is and go ahead and allow it to proceed. So now the project manager says we need to enhance the user experience by adding JavaScript. Please implement sorting for the tour dates table and then creating interactive hover effects, and if required, implement dynamic loading for the tour dates information. Hey, but I thought that was cool. That is putting in a lot of good practices that I might have to be sitting here and telling it myself interactively. It's taken care of for me in this multi-agent context. So the coding agent is going to run and test some things, and ultimately, writes a JavaScript file, and it already created the other files. So then we've got the project manager saying, okay, now we've added some JavaScript stuff. I have to look and see what hover effects it thought it was building. Now I say, how can I preview the site? And it thinks about a bunch of stuff, and let's say ultimately gets to, if you actually read what it says there, it says go ahead and package up all the files nicely, and the coding agent goes through. It created a zip file, but I have access to the environment. It's just saving this local where you run the notebook from. If you're running these notebooks, I like to run them myself in my own container. I can just jump into the container and access the files. Now I can run over to my VS Code. So let me go ahead and make this bigger. Also, you can see I've got my index HTML, the Taylor Swift HTML files. All right, so all the files that it's created. There's other files in here that I've created. It's probably a good practice if you want to write code for you. Put the notebook in its own folder so that way you've just got the notebook that you're running in that folder. If you're going to have it create files, you can clearly tell which files that it's created for that session, and it doesn't mix up with other files. Okay, so now I've using the live server extension. Actually, what I did here is I didn't run it from inside of this container, so I just pushed the update back up to my GitHub repository, running it from my local desktop. I've got live server extensions. If you go into VS Code extensions, you can search for live server. So I'm running this on live server, and here is the resultant site. I think one of the important things is there's definitely some more styling that could be used here. The table, there's no margins on the table, but I think the really powerful thing about this is before it even proceeded giving this back to me or even adding the JavaScript, it allowed me to have an opportunity to interactively engage through dialogue with it, to have it continue to update the styling in this to get it closer to how I want. Even if I were to continue to interact with those agents, it could just continue to refine and refine. I could look at this. So maybe I want my nav bar to be horizontal. Now notice these don't go anywhere. I didn't have it create all these pages, but we've got our hover elements to where these do hyperlink across my navbar items, and also my table is interactive, so I can sort by any, and there's actually it added sorting to every column. I thought that was pretty impressive. I may want to have different types of sorting function. I may want to restrict that, and you can continue to go ahead, and I have worked on some of these where I've continued to interact with the agency to have it continue to refine this design. So here we've got a pretty interesting scaffolding for a site. If I were to continue to work with agency and to build out this page, and I'd have a potentially usable site that I can publish, what was really impressive about this is I didn't expect this. I just expected a .html page that had a table on it. And this is also without using the Vision API. So I came up with all this styling without using any of our visual models, which also helped to keep costs down. So very interesting results from Agency Swarm. If you're going to develop your own custom stuff, there's some nuance to this. I went through several different examples, and some of them didn't work well. Others worked better. One critique that I've had is the logging. Now, I'm not saying I would recommend AutoGen Studio over this. They're two very different frameworks. My point is just one thing I noticed about AutoGen Studio is the logging is like exactly what you want it to be without even enabling logging. And I've gone into this. You can turn on the Python logging package in here, and you can change your logging levels to either informational or debug to get more information from the logging. But there is times where things would get stuck or lost that had to do full verbose debugging to get in and find out what was happening. That's one improvement I think that'll happen in time. And you can tell that they're writing the code to be able to have those various different log levels, see the agent interactions. So one minor critique is I would like to see some improvement in the logging there. And I'll have some additional pros and cons about this library and my overall first impressions review video I'll make to supplement this. If you'd like to copy this, to follow this tutorial exactly, if you go to my clone of the repository, you can see here, so github.com/AFEWELL/agency-swarm. By default, it's going to put you on the main branch, right? You're going to need to select notebook update a fuel. When you do that, you can go into the notebooks directory, and in here, I've left this pretty messy because there's been various experiments. The only website in this folder is the one that I generated. You can grab that if you'd like to see it. Or, more importantly though, is this Agency Swarm tutorial. Some of these other agencies I attempted creating, the other notebooks, they weren't working especially well. So when I follow this one, works well. Agency Swarm tutorial here in my branch, and you can get the same exact notebook that I've run through here and leverage that to learn and instantiate an agency and to can kind of improve and iterate on this if you're interested in going deeper with this very cool new framework. Thanks a lot for joining.